So if you will bear with me, I just want to talk a little bit about what happened yesterday in Alaska, and talk about it in terms of afflictions and karma, okay? So, yesterday in Alaska, Donnie and Vlad had a meeting. And it was kind of what Donnie usually would call a love fest. Yeah. They just really flattered each other and praised each other. Yeah. Now, were they doing that sincerely? Or were they doing that to get something out of the other person? Yeah. Now, how did they each wind up in that situation? Why was it Donnie and Vlad as the people in charge of the US and Russia? Yeah. Why wasn't it you and me? Okay, well, that has something to do with karma. Yeah. And, you know, if you look and see how each one developed in this life and developed certain qualities, made certain friends, took certain tests, did certain work, you know, gave certain political ideas and so on, that were different, then, you know, why did they say those things? Where did they get those ideas? Yeah. Well, you know, they were born into very different situations, And it makes me think, you know, if I were born, let's say, in Donnie's situation, with his parents, and the situation that surrounded him, and I was sent off to a military school, you know, and my father was extremely wealthy and had a lawyer friend who told me how to wiggle around everything. You know, I probably would have just turned out very much like him, because I have afflictions, he has afflictions. Once you're born into a certain situation, then it's easy for those afflictions to arise and steer your mind in a certain way. Now, it probably wouldn't have turned out exactly like him, because we do have different karma, we do have different tendencies, but what he experienced as a kid, I may have, you know, I would have responded probably in a similar way. Okay, why? Because of my afflictions. If somebody's telling me that the purpose of my life is to be rich and famous, and that's what constitutes a successful life, and to have a trophy wife, then, you know, as a little kid, you take all of that in, and a grown-up said it, so you believe it's true, and you work to attain that, because you have greed, you want wealth and fame and approval and, you know, all those things. You know, the affliction of attachment kind of comes up and propels you to chase after that. And then, you know, why would I have a certain attitude towards making other people into enemies? Well, because I have anger too. And when people do things I don't like, I judge them, and I have contempt for them, and I don't like them, and I stalk out my territory and see who's on my side and try and emphasize my power to control the situation. So I may have acted very much like him. Not exactly, but probably very much. Okay? So if you think about it that way, it's like you see how we're pushed by our karma of being born in situations, of being exposed to certain kind of conditioning, and we all have karma that responds to that, or afflictions that respond to that conditioning and either want more and better or to destroy it. We don't like what we're getting. Yeah? So you can see when this verse talks about, being bound by karma and afflictions, that's really true, It's easy to look at their lives and see that. It's sometimes harder to look at our own lives and think of ourselves as bound by karma and afflictions, because we don't feel like we're bound by them. We feel like we are independent people with wisdom who make our own decisions and can control our life and control our decisions. Don't you feel that way? Yeah? Here I am, I look at things, I make a decision. My decisions are always the right ones. They don't always bring what I want because other people don't cooperate, but my decisions are still, very good, and I am in control. Yeah. When you have so much conditioning from past lives and from this life, how much control do we have? How much are we even aware of the decisions that we make? How much do we really examine things and make wise decisions? And how much does our pride and our attachment and our thirst for revenge just push us to act in certain ways? Automatic. Yeah? And that's scary. That's downright scary. Yeah? We happen to be maybe a little bit more fortunate than, in having some awareness of afflictions and karma and the role they play in our life, And we have some exposure to the Buddhist teachings saying that, we don't perceive things accurately and that lies behind the afflictions and the karma. So we have, some little inkling that, maybe I'm not in control as much as I think. And, yeah. But still, there's that feeling that, there's me here, and yeah, I'm bright, I'm intelligent, and I make good decisions, and da-da-da-da-da. Okay? And is that true? Yeah, is it true? It's hard to say, isn't it? Do we make good decisions? I was writing to a friend this afternoon, and we were talking about how we make decisions. And it made me think of one of the inmates that I corresponded with for many years and who joined our first Vajrasattva winter retreat here. Okay. His name was Bo. And he had a 20-year sentence for drug dealing. And he had been in, I think, just about that whole sentence and was, on the verge of getting out. And we started corresponding. And in one letter, what he did is he traced back, because he had gone dealing drugs for many, many years and made a very good income from it. Yeah. And then it was the last deal that he was going to do. And he thought, I'd just do one more deal, get a lot of money, and then I'm going to quit. Okay. So he had, bought these drugs from I don't know where. He had stored them in, one of the storage places where you rent like a room. And he got busted that one, the very last time. Okay, so he, that was how he landed in prison with his 20-year sentence with that. Okay, and he was while we were writing, he looked back and he traced back, okay, here I was, the very last deal I was going to do, make a lot of money, then retire from drug dealing. Okay, now how did I get in that? What decisions did I make that made me do that? And then what did I do that made me do that? And he started tracing things back of the decisions and choices he made that led him to that last deal that didn't go through as he thought it would. And he was tracing it back to when he was a little kid, and just choices he made as a little kid, and kind of just things about, who you choose to play marbles with, and then that influences who your friends are in high school, which influences, what you do, and so on and so forth. So he traced them back, and he came up with the term SIDS, okay, S-I-D, seemingly insignificant decisions. Yeah, because he was thinking, when I was 8 years old, I chose to do this and that, which led me to meet this person, which led to doing da-da-da-da-da. And it was just very many just decisions that, were very, very small, but wound up taking him in a certain direction in his life. And I started looking, when he had written this, I started looking at my life, and I could see certain decisions that I made, that didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but they really, really changed the course of my life. For example, going to Bodhi Tree Bookstore one Sunday morning. That's not a big decision, is it? You go to a bookstore to look for books, Well, that's where I saw the flyer, and I went to one lecture in town, which led me to go to the retreat, which led me to give up my job and go to Japan, which led me to ordain, blah, blah, blah. Okay? It's a small thing. And, there's so many decisions like that. And I think Juan Carlos, you in coming here, you had that kind of decision, wasn't it? Yeah. And just one small thing, and you wound up hearing about this course and came here, instead of going to grad school and getting your MBA.
I was submitting my application to the MBA program.
And, say it into the mic.
I was submitting my application to an MBA program, and I was copy-pasting essays from Word to the application thing. And I was rereading the essays, and I was like, why do you want to do an MBA program? I thought, I don't want to do an MBA program. And I was reading my response, and I was like, this isn't true. Like, none of this is true. So I just impulsed open another tab on my computer, and I Googled how to become a Buddhist monk. And then second result on Google was exploring monastic life program. I clicked on that. I read it and I was like, yeah, I mean, this makes sense. And here I am.
Yeah. Yeah, just a seemingly small thing, what you clicked on, on the internet, yeah? And then this decision, hopefully, will, yeah, I mean, just imagine you get an MBA and then, what would your life turn to be like? You don't want it, you don't really want to do that career, but you get the degree anyway, because what else am I going to do? And it makes your parents happy, and you go and do that, and then what kind of life do you have? Yeah. So, these small decisions that we make, and so some of them seem, that they happen according to chance. I think, our karma might have some power over that, but also the way we happen to be thinking at that moment. If I had been, really in a hurry when I went into that bookstore, I may not have even noticed the flyer. Yeah. So, there's things like that. They're dependent arising, so to speak, dependent on many causes, many conditions. Yeah. Okay. And so the root of that whole thing is ignorance. Yeah. And there's many kinds of ignorance. The kind of ignorance that's the root of the whole mess is the ignorance that grasps at inherent existence. Okay. That things, people and phenomena exist, I have the hiccups, that exist objectively in and of themselves, okay? So that's what we are going to be refuting, going through this, yeah. Now, it's not so easy to understand, and the reasoning. And even when you've understood the reasoning, to really bring it into your life, yeah, is also not so easy. It really takes time to do this, yeah. If realizing emptiness, the emptiness of inherent existence, were quick, cheap, and easy, we would have done it a long time ago, and we would have already attained awakening. Okay, but it's not so easy, and what is easy is being led by our afflictions. Yeah, the Tibetans often talk about, in India you see donkeys with a ring in their nose, yeah, and that's how the owner pulls them, Can you imagine somebody pulling you with a rope attached to a ring in your nose? Yeah, and the donkey just has to follow, That's the way it is. So, that is how we are with our ignorance, We're just like the donkey, and our ignorance grabs the ring on our nose and just drags us here and drags us there. Yeah. And from the ignorance arises attachment, anger, revenge, arrogance, laziness, lack of integrity, all these other gems of attitudes and emotions that make a mess in our life. Okay? So this is the situation that we're in. And to, get out of it, we have to realize emptiness, yeah. So emptiness, as we talked about last time, it doesn't mean nothing exists. Yeah, it means there's a certain type of existence that phenomena don't have. Yeah, so they don't, and that type of existence is inherent existence. So nothing exists inherently. However, we think everything exists inherently. So what we're trying to prove to ourselves is that something that does not exist, in fact, does not exist. Okay, because we think it does. Yeah, everything we look around and see appears inherently existent, and we assent to that. Yeah, so that's called the extreme of absolutism. We talked about this in the talk last month. Okay, now when we start to negate that things exist that way, yeah, then we're leaving the extreme of absolutism, and it's very easy to then flip and say, oh, nothing exists the way it appears to my senses, so nothing exists at all. And it's easy to flip into nihilism. Okay? Yeah, because our mind is so sure that things exist the way they appear to us and the way we apprehend them, that if we negate that, then we just say, well, nothing exists, yeah, which is the extreme of nihilism. So both of these are to be avoided. Okay. So here in this chapter, we start using some of the reasonings, yeah, to prove to ourselves that things do not inherently exist. So I'm going to read here. Okay, so His Holiness says, sometimes we may wonder, why was I born who I was? Why wasn't I born as someone else? Yeah, why weren't you born like to be like Vlad or to be like Donnie? Yeah. In asking this question, we assume there is a separate self from the circumstances of our life. There's a solid me, and then there's all the circumstances of my life. Okay? In other words, a doer apart from the karma, the causes that made me be what I am, and the result of being who I am. Okay? Yet such an agent, such an independent agent, does not exist, nor do causes and results exist as substantial entities. Yeah. So when we're grasping an inherent existence, we might say, oh yes, I believe in causes and effects. Yeah. But when we think about them, we have a very simplistic view. Yeah. We see things like they are, there's one cause for something. Yeah. Just one cause, and then that result comes. Yeah. Actually, when you stop, it's not just one cause. Okay, what's a good example? Lunch today, okay? So Venerable Thubten said that the things that were supposed to be cookies that wound up looking like flat mini pizzas with chocolate chips on top. Yeah. She said that that was because the recipe called for, 2 1/4 cups of flour, and she put in 1 1/4 cup. Okay. Something like that. Okay, so was that just the only cause why the cookies turned out that way? Well, we have to look at what were all the causes that brought Venerable Thubten to be cooking that day? And what were all the causes that made her ordained and that made her find the Abbey, and that, everything that came before that, so that she chose to ordain? And why was she the person who was cooking? And why did she decide to try to make chocolate chip cookies? And, why did that slip come of not putting in enough flour? And who made the flour? Where did the flour come from? What are all the causes of the flour? What were all the causes of the butter? What were all the causes of she said she put an egg in it, And then you start looking at everything that, made just one cookie, and it's the cause, so many causes that go back and back and back and back, because we can't just look at, why is she on the cooking today? It's like, well, what are all the causes for the Abbey? Because she was cooking at the Abbey. And what are the causes for the Abbey? When you start looking back, how many people were involved in creating the Abbey, and where did their lives come from, and where did their interest in the Dharma come from? And when you start looking, it's like one single thing. There's the dependent arising is so, whoa, how can you ever understand all of this? Because as you go back and back, there's so many causes and conditions. Okay? And just think that the Buddha can see those. Wow. And he didn't have to study in a school and take a test to do that. It came from realizing emptiness and purifying the mind. Okay? But it's just vast to understand all of this. But we tend to think, oh, there's one cause. She got distracted, so she didn't measure the flour right. That's it. There's lots of things going on. Okay? So things are not really so simple. The dependent arisings are quite complicated. Okay. So in the path of purification, Buddhaghosa, he's one of the very famous Pali scholars who wrote 5th century AD. Yeah. So he quoted the ancient Sri Lankan Buddhist pandits. Yeah. And this is what they said. This is from the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification. Yeah. Now, before I read what he said, we usually think of, Pali tradition, they believe this. Mahayana tradition, they believe this. Yeah, they're both Buddhists, but they don't agree on a lot of different things. Yeah? We tend to think like that. Okay, and listen to what Buddhaghosa said. See if you've studied Nagarjuna, see if this may sound a little familiar. There is no doer of a deed or one who reaps the deed's results. Phenomena alone flow on. No other view than this is right. What does he mean? There's no doer of a deed. There's a person who created the karma. There's somebody who made this thermos. Yeah, somebody who filled it with water. What do you mean there's no doer of a deed? So when he's saying this, he's being very much like Nagarjuna, It means there's no inherently existent doer of a deed. Yeah? Okay. And so, what karma and result thus causally maintain their round, karma producing a result which becomes the dependent conditioning to act in it that produces more karma and brings another result that creates a situation that again you act in and creates more karma. So while karma and result thus causally maintain their round, as seed and tree succeed in turn, no first beginning can be shown. Yeah, where's there a beginning to the human mind? Yeah, and you say, oh, well, the example of a seed and a tree, yeah, well, there must have been a first seed. Yeah, because evolution, it was like there was the Big Bang. There were no seeds in the Big Bang. There must have been a first seed. Where did the first seed come from? Where did the Big Bang come from? All of them came from prior causes. So the first seed may not have grown on a tree, yeah, but it was an accumulation of certain atoms and molecules in a certain form. And maybe there wasn't one first seed. Maybe there were a whole bunch of them. Yeah, we don't really know. But anyway, whatever there was, it came from something else before it that probably wasn't a seed. Yeah, and so on and so forth. Okay. Nor in the future round of births can they be shown not to occur. Non-Buddhists, not knowing this, have failed to gain self-mastery. Okay, so because of not thinking about dependent arising and the absence of inherent existence, then, the non-Buddhists, they may attain serenity, they may, meditate in single-pointedness and even be reborn, for eons in the form of formless realms, but they haven't mastered their own mind. In other words, they haven't attained freedom from afflictions and karma. Okay, so talking about the non-Buddhists, they assume a being, see it as eternal or annihilated. So they assume a doer, an agent, a person who acts, an independent, objectively existent person. That is either, when it says eternal, it means lasting without changing at all, forever, like having a soul, or annihilated, ceasing and there's no result at all. Okay? So they see it in one of those two extremes. They adopt the 62 wrong views, each contradicting the other. So in one of the other sutras, the Buddha detailed 62 wrong views. Don't ask me why there's not 63 or 61. And probably if you really dissect them, there's probably more, and if you assume them together, you could say less. Anyway, but they contradict each other. The stream of craving bears them on, caught in the meshes of their views. And as the stream thus bears them on, they are not freed from dukkha. So, pushed by the mental continuum goes forth, due to craving, always grasping more, arriving at the time of death, grasping at having another rebirth, reborn again, and the whole cycle continues. And that's really when you think of wow, how deep this suffering is. Yeah. You don't get a break between lives. It's like, can't I just have a break and be peaceful and nothing bothering me, No, because we're pushed by all these causes and conditions. A monastic disciple of the Buddha with direct knowledge of this fact can penetrate this deep and subtle empty conditionality. Okay, empty conditionality. Empty things are free of inherent existence. Conditionality, they arise dependent on causes and conditions. Yeah. And so just those two words, dependent conditionality, this is, the key that we really want to realize, the emptiness, how things are free of all the, wrong views and inherent existence and so on that we project on them, yet they still exist. They exist, but they don't exist in the way that they appear to us. Okay, how do they exist? Then the question is, well, how does a Buddha see things? If he doesn't see things as inherently existent, how does he see things? Yeah, so I asked this once with His Holiness, one of the interviews, how does the Buddha see things? So there were a couple of other geshes there. They got into a big, long discussion. And at the end, His Holiness turns to me and say, "We don't know." Yeah. But when you think, how does the Buddha see? He must know all these causes and conditions that come together to produce something, but that what they produce in the very next split second is something else. It's not like something is produced and then stays permanent. Yeah. Well, we might go, oh, but this is the same gong as that was here last month when we had class. Yeah, the gong didn't change. Really? Really? So if you looked at a microscopic level, or smaller than microscopic, none of the atoms changed. None of the electrons went whizzing around. Yeah, moving, changing into something else. None of the atoms of this got sloughed off. Yeah, it wasn't affected by the climate at all. Yeah. So the changes may happen slowly, but nothing ever remains the same as it is in the very next moment. Why? Because it's produced by causes and conditions. Yeah? So it isn't like causes and conditions come together, now everything's permanent, doesn't change. We think like that. And that's why we're so surprised if, this fell off and all of a sudden broke. Why we're so surprised when somebody dies. Yeah. Yeah, Tanner, died a few weeks ago. One of our friends who was only 34, suddenly, they don't know why still, and he's gone. It's like, wait a minute, he's only 34. He was, he's been up here, he was in good health, he's bright, he's fun. What? And you're telling me that all that remains of Tanner was that very fine powder that we then scattered on the knoll? Yeah, and that his mind stream is, we don't know where. And it was interesting because one of his friends asked, I think Venerable Chuni, or somebody asked, where do you think Tanner is now? That question's quite interesting. Where do you think Tanner is now? What are you going to identify as Tanner? Yeah, the body's gone. The mind is he has a new set of aggregates. Tanner does not exist. There's a continuum of the consciousness. But the person that we knew does not exist. It isn't like he died and then, he went having the same personality, and he's born now in some other life. No. He's going through this whole different experience, going through the bardo. Who knows what in the world he was thinking when he died, what kind of karma ripened. Yeah. And even when he is, takes rebirth in that other life, he's not going to speak English and say, oh, yeah, hi, I'm Tanner. Now I'm born as, so-and-so. No, did you think that when you were born in the mother's womb? Anybody have even a remembrance of being, conceived? You land in your mother's womb. Oh, hi, Mom. Okay. So things don't last, and their impermanence actually helps to prove their transient, the fact that they don't inherently exist. Because something that exists objectively out there, distinct, it doesn't depend on other causes and conditions. It's just there. Okay? Like we walk in the room, and the gong is just there, and this is just here, and the table is here. And, if we think about it, oh yeah, these things all were created and made, but if we don't think about it, we react to all of this as if it's just always been there. This has always been a table, this has always been a thermos, and so on. Yeah. But there was a time when the thermos and the table and all these things did not exist. The wood for the table existed. The metal for the gong existed. But in different forms. And when the wood is still in the form of a tree, you don't look at the tree and say, there's a table. And when you look at this, you don't say, oh, there's a tree. Okay? They're different phenomena, but one was the cause of the next. Yeah. And so the fact that what makes them impermanent is that they depend on causes and conditions. Okay? That dependency on causes and conditions also means that they are not existing objectively, because something that exists objectively out there does not depend on causes and conditions. It's just there. Okay? So it's like when we think I. When you think, I'm sitting here, does that I seem to exist depending on causes and conditions? Do you feel like you depend on causes and conditions, and that without those causes and conditions you wouldn't exist? No, I am here. Yeah, do you have that sense? I am here. Yeah, okay, yes, I got born and I grew up, but that I does not depend on anything. Yeah, that I, it's somewhere mixed in, but also independent, separate. So already, how the I appears to us, there's something kind of contradictory in it. Yeah. Because sometimes when we say I, we're referring to our body or to our mind. I'm walking. I'm thinking. Yeah. So there, the I seems, I'm walking. The I seems to be the body. I'm thinking. The I seems to be the mind. Okay. But then sometimes, okay, first, if the I were the body or mind, we should be able to identify which part of the body it is, or which, part of the mind, which consciousness it is. Yeah, but we can't, that becomes very difficult to do. Yeah. But it seems like it's just there. Yeah. That I just am there. And sometimes I don't see myself as the body and mind. I see the I as the owner of the body and mind. My body is uncomfortable. Okay, when we say my body is uncomfortable, or my toe hurts, yeah, then the I is here, and the body or the toe or whatever it is there, and I is the owner, the possessor of it. So if you possess it, you're not the same as it. Yeah. So are you your body, or do you possess a body? Are you, is the I, is the person, one consciousness? Or is the I separate from the body and mind, and it just possesses them? So here's the I floating around in space, you can't see it, but you can't see it, but it's still floating around in space. And then there's a body and mind. What makes them come together? Well, somehow they get together, the body and mind come together, and then I just jump in. Yeah? Is that what we think? That the I is just some kind of thing floating around? And it just happens to go, oh, I want this body and mind. Okay. Does the I think without, if it's separate than the consciousness? Yeah. Is your I one of the I, the self, one of your consciousnesses? It is? Which one?
Well, they're separate.
What?
They're separate.
The what?
They are separate.
They're separate. So your consciousness is here, but I asked you, are you your consciousness? And you said yes. So then I said, which consciousness are you?
I think I should stop talking now.
Okay. Okay. So if we can't say I am my consciousness, then how do you think, or then do you possess a consciousness? So that you're here and your consciousness is there and the I grabs that consciousness? Or can the I think with being something totally independent and unrelated to the consciousness? We say I think, but isn't it the consciousness that thinks? So are we separate than the consciousness? If we're separate, then what are we? Because if we objectively exist, we should be able to pinpoint what we are. Okay? So you get into all of this and you can't pinpoint anything. Yeah. But there's this feeling of, I am just there. I don't depend on causes and conditions. Yeah. But we do, don't we? But then it feels weird. Ooh, I depend on causes and I only exist because the causes and conditions for me exist? You mean it's possible that I didn't exist? And then we go to nihilism. Yeah, oh, I don't exist at all. That's another wrong view. Mm-hmm.
Geshe Dawdle had this phrase, things exist at the mercy of their causes and conditions.
Yeah. Things are at the mercy of their causes and conditions. Yep. And what happens depends on causes and conditions. Yeah. So we can influence some of those causes and conditions. We can influence which ones arise at a certain time, but we cannot control the whole shebang. And there is no omniscient being who's in control of the whole shebang. Okay? We like to say, okay, I'm not, but there's God. And God exists, but nobody created him. Yeah? Or did any of your Sunday school classes teach you, say how God came to be? No, he just always was there. Okay, well, what created God? And if at the beginning there was nothing except God, and now there's this whole thing going on, what made God start to create? You know, to go from having a consciousness that doesn't create to then want to create, there had to have been some influence from some other factor, some interaction, some dependent arising that made God change so that God then would, unroll the whole thing in 7 days. Yeah, it works fast. He should have slowed down, done a better job. What?
We should have got him to build the Buddha hall.
Yeah. So, when you start thinking, because nothing can appear without causes and conditions. Yeah, and if something exists, for it to change means that it is interacting with some other condition. Yeah. But if God was all alone, nothing else existed, what did he interact with? And how can God, we only differentiate he and she because there's both of them. You can't have a God that is male without having the dependent arising of female. Yeah? So then, why is God male? I don't know. Okay, but do you see, this is the kind of investigation that we have to do to really come to understand how things arise and exist and function. Yeah? Okay, let's keep reading this. There is no karma or cause in result, nor does result exist in karma, nor does result exist in the cause. Although they are empty of one another, there is no fruit without the karma. There's no result without a cause. Okay. So let's look at cause and result. So here's where our gardening class begins. Yeah. Yeah, when we were studying with Geshe Zopa, we used to say, okay, it's time for gardening class. Let's go up to the temple and learn about seeds and plants. Yeah, that's the usual example. Okay, so does a tree exist without the seed that it grew from? No. Okay. So the tree depends on the seed. Yeah. The tree, the result, depends on here. We're just talking about one cause, what happens to be what we call the substantial cause, the main cause that becomes the tree. Yeah. Okay. Is the seed the same thing as the tree? No. Now, if the seed had its own entity that made it a seed, and the tree had its own entity objectively existing out there that made it a tree, how in the world did the seed become a tree? The seed is, you look at we have huge trees out there. Yeah, seeds are like this big. How did something this big become something, how many feet tall are those, 100 feet or, they're big trees. How did this become something that big? Yeah, it was affected by other things. What was it affected by? Soil, okay, water in the soil, nutrients in the soil, yeah. But it had to be the right temperature for the seed to start to sprout. Did the seed immediately become the tree? No, it stayed in the ground for a while as just a sprout that we didn't see, and then it started to poke itself up, above. Yeah. So it became the tree gradually. But what actually became the tree? Was there one cause? Were there many causes? At what point did that small thing become what you would call a tree? Yeah, when it sprouted and it was still under the ground, that's not a tree. When the sprout came out and it was this big, is that a tree? When it's this big? Outside Prajna, the cottage where I live, yeah, if you look closely, there's 2 small cedar trees. Cedar trees, they're the huge ones. There's 2 cedar trees, probably about this big now. Yeah. They're easy to miss. In fact, when you look at it, you wouldn't say there's a cedar tree. You would say, oh, there's something growing there. It was only when you looked closely and saw that the needles on it resembled in some way the needles on the big tree, that we would say, oh, that's the sprout of a cedar tree. But when did that seed become a sprout? And when does the sprout going to be a tree? Yeah. Sometimes when you're working in the forest, there's some really big cedar trees, and then you find baby cedar trees that are maybe like this big. Yeah. We say there's a baby cedar tree. Is a baby cedar tree a cedar tree? Or is it a baby? Or is it a sprout? Yeah. Is it still a sprout when it's that big? Because the result one is huge. So when does it go from being a sprout to being a tree? What?
Then it becomes a sapling.
A sapling.
It's a child, a cedar tree.
A sapling. Okay. So a sapling is bigger than a sprout?
Then a baby cedar tree, yes, bigger than a sprout.
But a baby cedar tree is a sapling? Okay. So when did the sprout become the sapling? And when did the sapling become a tree? Can you tell us what time? Can you tell us exactly what size it goes? Is it this big and it's a sapling, and then one atom bigger, it's now a tree? When does it become a tree? Yeah? Okay. So you begin to have some feeling about how things are merely designated. Yeah? They're merely designated. What designates them? Our minds. Okay. What do we fight about? Very often, what the designation is. Okay? Because somebody says, I'm selling cedar trees, and you go in there and you expect, well, it couldn't be 100 feet tall, you couldn't dig it up, but you expect a good-sized thing, yeah, and it's this big. It's not a sapling. Sapling's this big. So it's a cedar tree, And you say, wait a minute, you said you were selling cedar trees. You're just selling me a sapling. And the guy knows, no, this is a tree. And you say, no, it's a sapling. Yeah. And he says, no, it's a tree. Can't you see it's big enough to be a tree? And you say, no, it's just a sapling. Yeah. Who's right and who's wrong? Yeah. Do you have a vote? Yeah. Because it might be one price for a sapling and another price for a tree. Yeah. So you want to buy the tree at the price of the sapling because you want a good deal. Yeah. So you keep saying it's a sapling, it's a sapling. Yeah. Yeah. But then if you don't buy it then and you come back next week, maybe it's going to be a tree. So these designations are, they seem so permanent. If you look at the cedar tree and somebody said that's a pine tree, Venerable Semke would say, no, it's not a pine tree, it's a cedar tree. Can't you see? You look at it and inside there's something that's saying, hi, I'm a cedar tree. Yeah. Unless the tree is growing in China, and then what does it say? It says, ni hao, How does it say I'm a cedar tree in Chinese? Yeah, you have to have a conference to decide what the name, how to say it. Yeah? Yeah. So what is it? Is it the Chinese name? Is it the American name? Does it have two names? But if it's one object, and it really is that tree or that ishkabobble, as you say in Chinese. No, sorry, it's not ishkabobble in Chinese. It's sure. Yeah. Yeah, right, sure. Oh, she's looking it up. By what? By two. Yeah. But there's only one.
There's a pronunciation for mainland and for Taiwan.
Oh, one is by one and one is by two. Okay. But you know what we call it, it isn't that thing inside of it. Yeah. You can see that it has to do with, you know, our idea of what a cedar tree looks like. Yeah, and we give it that name. And if we aren't clear what a cedar tree looks like, we might call it a pine and go through our whole life of calling it a pine tree. Yeah, but it'll still function like a cedar tree, even if we call it a pine tree. But if you try and sell it to somebody and say it's a cedar tree when it's a pine tree, that guy's going to, report you to the Better Business Bureau because you're lying. Okay. So it's quite interesting. You really start to look at things and you begin to see how our conventional world is really quite messy. Yeah, and no wonder we don't get along. Yeah, because we give different terms to one object. And sometimes there's something that we see as one object that somebody else sees as two objects. And then you fight, is it one or is it two? Okay. When Putin looks at a certain landmass, yeah, that includes the Crimea, yeah, and he says, this is Russia. When Zelensky looks at that landmass, he says, here's Russia and here's Ukraine. They're two different countries. And by the way, Crimea belongs to Ukraine. It doesn't belong to Russia. Well, let's have a war to see what name we give it. Amazing when you think about it, isn't it? It's over what name do we call it? Because according to the name, then you have power over the people and the resources on that land. Why do you have power over people and resources? Because the whole world says, oh, there's a leader. And this is the job of the leader to, have power over these things. Yeah. So Putin says, I have power over Russia. Yeah. Yes. Ukraine exists. It's a province of Russia. Yeah. And Ukraine says, forget it. We're a separate country. And Russia says, no. Because Catherine, fell under Russia, under Catherine the Great. And people in Ukraine say, yeah, that's nice, but it didn't stay as Russia. After the First World War, it became an independent country. And it was an independent country when you invaded. And Russia says, we didn't invade. This is our land. Okay, we fight over things like that, yeah. And so one person looks at, they say, this is Ukraine, this is Russia. Exactly what are they labeling Ukraine and Russia? Is it the dirt? Are they looking at, a bunch of dirt enough to fill this? And they say, that's Ukraine? That wouldn't be Ukraine. But if you turn that dirt and you spilled it on something, wouldn't it be part of Ukraine? Well, if it's part of Ukraine, doesn't it have Ukraine nature in it? Doesn't that dirt say, I'm Ukraine? Well, Putin says, no, that dirt says, I'm Russia. The dirt talks? Okay. So our conventional world, you get some sense that things exist by being merely designated, and that how messy things are because of that. And yet, if we say it has to be independent of designation, then if it were independent of designation, then there would be something in the object that makes it that thing and only that thing. Then you have to find out what it is that makes it that thing. But if you have a whole bunch of dirt here, do you think you're going to be able to tell the difference between Ukrainian dirt and American dirt? What is American dirt anyway? American dirt in North Carolina is very different than American dirt in Nevada. Well, how could they both be called America with the same name if they're different? Okay, so this kind of thing, just to, start seeing how things are dependent on designation, and they have to have a base there, and there has to be a mind that designates them. Then we go, whose mind? Try and point to one mind that is the authority, whose designation is always sound and makes it that object. Is there one person that designates something? When you were born, you got a name. Who gave you that name? Mom? Dad? Grandma? Grandpa? Who? Nobody. Oh, you didn't get a name without nobody giving it to you, but who gave it to you? Well, I was named after, so I can tell you who I was named after, but her name doesn't sound very much like my name. It's very strange. You think about it. Okay, so I had intended to go through the rest of this chapter. We didn't finish this whole thing. Even Buddhaghosa's quotation. Or no, we did. I did do that. Finish. No, I didn't. Let me finish it, okay? As fire does not exist inside the sun, a gem, cow dung, or yet outside them, but is brought to be by means of its component parts. Yeah, so you can use cow dung to cook, but where's the fire in the cow dung? Yeah. So neither can result be found within the karma, nor without, nor does the karma still persist in the result it has produced. So once the seed produces the result, the ceases. Yeah. Because the seeds cannot exist at the same time as the sprout. So is there one moment where the seed just cuts and ceases, and the very next moment, now it's a sprout? Can you find that point? Yeah, but there has to be some point, otherwise the seed would continue when the sprout exists. Or the sprout would be in the seed before the seed became a sprout. Okay? Yeah, your gardening class gets really interesting. Yeah? Chandakirti makes it very interesting. Well, Nagarjuna does too. Okay. If the karma of its fruit is empty, no fruit exists yet in the karma, and still the fruit is born from it, wholly depending on the karma. The result does not exist inside the cause, and the cause does not exist inside the result. But somehow that cause produces that result. How does it produce that result if they don't exist at the same time? But if they existed at the same time, how could one produce the other? Because I think we all would agree that the cause doesn't exist when the result does. Okay? For here there is no Brahma God, creator of the round of births. Phenomena alone flow on, cause and component their condition. That's what Buddhaghosa has to say. And it's totally in line with Nagarjuna. Completely. Yeah. So, do the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition, are they that different? Okay, well, let some other people debate that one. Okay, so there's no time for questions now. We kind of ran out. Yeah, well, yeah, I asked you a lot of questions. So, yeah, so we had questions. We just didn't have answers. Okay, so let's dedicate the merit.